this morning. First of all, I'd like to welcome everybody to our program here today, the Southeast Region Beef and Forage um, Initiative Program, sponsored by our Southeast Region Beef Cattle Initiative team. That's made up of several agents around the Southeast region, an area that encompasses about 36 counties along the Texas Gulf Coast, stretching from Nueces County all the way to Orange County. This group of agents have worked hard with their specialists to put these programs on around the state and especially around our region. But this one today is going to be focused in on entirely on looking at how to manage for drought, and then so we're going to have several different topics that we'll be talking about this morning, and several good speakers that we have lined out for you. So this morning's session is going to go from now until about noon. We will have presentations that'll be lasting about 45 minutes. With some time for some questions at the end of the presentation. Just a few housekeeping things for everybody. We would ask that you mute your microphones and leave your videos off, because that helps us with our bandwidth whenever we're trying to broadcast things on the internet. So, and whenever we leave our mics open, sometimes we can hear the things that are going on behind us. And so oftentimes that's either construction or equipment or somebody making food, or there's no telling what all goes on. But let's go ahead and just mute our microphones. And so if you don't know where that microphone mute button is, it's a little microphone, and all you have to do is just click it, and you'll have a little line that will go through it, and that'll indicate that you're muted. Same thing with your video. So we'll go ahead and do that for us, and I see that just about everybody is. At the end of the meeting, you will be receiving a link to a Qualtrics survey, to a survey, just really a questionnaire about what you learned during the meeting. So hopefully we want to utilize that to make our programs better. This is kind of a new thing for us in Extension, is to do a lot of online programming. So we're certainly interested in what you have to say at the end of the meeting in regards to not only the content, but also how it was delivered. So we would appreciate you filling that out. Also on our line today is my administrative assistant, which is Lindsay Munyon, and she is going to help to monitor that text chat, and then also help to make sure everybody's mics are muted. So special thanks to her for helping with this activity today. So, and if you haven't found the chat feature is right next to the raised hand. If you really want to ask a question during the presentation, go ahead and hit that raise your hand feature, and that will allow you to raise your hand, and we will hopefully notice that, and we will call on you. So, before we get started, does anybody have any questions? Okay. So the last thing I would say before we get kicked off is this is a series of 2 meetings that will be happening. This one today, again, covering drought. And we do have one next week, which will be on the on June the 10th. That will be Beef Cattle Marketing Outlook. And and then also an update on fever ticks and the CARES Act. So a lot of good speakers for that one as well. So be sure to mark the calendar for that. Tell your friends about that one. Again, that'll be taking place next Wednesday at 9 a.m. That one will be rolling from 9 a.m. till about 11:15 or so. So be sure to pass that information along for us if you wouldn't mind. So we're going to get kicked off with our drought program here. I know that most of everybody along the Gulf Coast got a little bit of rain this past week, and so that certainly made everybody's spirits a little bit higher. And whenever we get a little rain, the grass grows, it turns green, and We think we're out of the woods, and sometimes that's a misconception. So because in Texas we are always one day closer to the next drought, unfortunately. And although we've had some good rains here recently, we all know that we were pretty dry going into this time frame, and I think it's very appropriate that we're talking not only about drought today, we're talking about some weather issues, because that will be certainly on people's minds right now with the storm that's out in the Gulf. So our first speaker is going to talk to us about pasture management during drought and after drought. And that's going to be Dr. Vanessa Corriher-Olson from Overton. She is our one of our forage specialists, one of the only forage specialists that we have in Texas. So she covers a pretty good swath of Texas. And then following her will be Maureen Frank, and she'll talk about wildlife and managing wildlife during drought. And then our own Dr. Megan Clayton from Corpus Christi, our extension range specialist, she'll be talking about rangeland considerations during dry times. And then that will be followed up by our state climatologist, Dr. John Nelson Gammon. And he'll be giving us the outlook, the weather outlook for the foreseeable future and what we can expect with our weather patterns. So get things kicked off this morning. Let's talk about pasture. Let's talk about grasses. Let's talk about how we manage those during and after a drought. So I'm going to turn the microphone over, the presentation over to Dr. Vanessa Corriher-Olson. Again, she is a forage specialist out of the Overton Center. So Vanessa, take it away.
All right, thanks, Philip. So like you said, my name is Vanessa Corriher-Olson. I'm a forage extension specialist. Many of you may or may not be familiar with me. I am located in Overton, Texas, which is northeast Texas, where we tend to have more rainfall, fortunately or unfortunately, than you guys at times. However, during 2011, we were all subject to that severe extreme drought in the entire state. So we do understand, and we do suffer from drought conditions at times and drier conditions than what we might be used to. So I'm going to focus, just to let you know in advance, that I'm going to focus on introduced, or what we often refer to as improved forages. So forages that are not native to the state of Texas, that have been introduced or brought into our state for forage production because of their persistence or their production, their higher yields potentially. So things such as Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, some warm season perennials that are referred to as being improved, and they have been introduced into our state. So they're not native species. I think Dr. Clayton will focus a little bit more on some of our native rangelands than I will this morning. So first and foremost, unfortunately, during a drought or during extremely dry times, there's not really much that we can do about increasing forage production. We don't recommend fertilizing when we have extremely dry conditions. We need moisture for uptake of those nutrients, so we don't necessarily want to waste those resources. However, there are a lot of things that we can do as forage producers during good growing conditions, as well as after a drought, to help promote or maintain the persistence of those forages and practice better management skills, or follow better management practices in order to maintain more forage for a little bit longer period of time as droughts start to become an issue on our property. So we're going to talk about some of the management practices, some things that we can do, kind of some during drought, but also following a drought. And some of these we can apply during good growing conditions. And I try to remind producers of that quite frequently. Even when we have adequate rainfall, we still need to follow best management practices, because like Philip said, we're just one day from another drought. We do live in Texas. We can have periods of time, especially during the summer, where we have very little rainfall, and that can have a huge impact, obviously, on our forage production. So there can be a lot of species differences, and as well as some variety differences when we talk about forages and their tolerance, or how quickly they are impacted by drought conditions. Our shallow rooted annuals, plants that are are established from seed. They are great for kind of serving as an emergency forage option. They can fill a void during that summer. They often grow very quickly. They can be very productive, even in a little bit drier conditions compared to some of our perennial forages. However, when we end up in extreme drought, a lot of times, or most of the time, they're going to be the first thing that kind of peters out or even potentially dies. So grasses such as crabgrass, our small grains or ryegrass forages that we might be using in the winter, their forage production is highly dependent on moisture. Legumes can fall under that as well. Once again, their forage production is very dependent on rainfall and moisture availability. Some of our shallow-rooted perennials would fall next, such as common Bermuda grass, Bahia grass, Dallas grass. In regards to our Bermuda grass varieties, we have seeded varieties such as common Bermuda grass, but we also have hybrid or varieties that have to be established from vegetative materials such as sprigs or tops. So we have things like Tifton 85 or coastal. When we compare some of those varieties, Tifton 85 is much more drought tolerant compared to coastal Bermuda grass, and definitely Jigs Bermuda grass is probably the least drought tolerant of our hybrid or hybrid varieties of Bermuda grass, compared to our seedlings as well, our seeded varieties as well. So there can be some variety differences. Now, just because there are variety or species differences in regards to drought tolerance, that doesn't mean that we're immune from following some other best management practices such as grazing pressure or fertility or weed control or what have you. So there's a lot of different things we need to think about in regards to overall forage management. Now, species and variety selection can be part of that. We obviously want to try to select species or varieties that are adapted to our location, our soil type, our average annual rainfall, and we may also want to pay attention to those that could possibly be a little bit more drought tolerant compared to other species, especially in the state of Texas, where drought can be very common. So our deeper rooted perennials, like I mentioned, our hybrid Bermuda grass varieties, as well as some other introduced species, Klein grass, old world blue stems, and then there's some rangeland species that I'm sure Megan will cover that can be oftentimes a little bit more drought tolerant compared to some of our introduced or improved varieties. And one thing also to keep in mind, even though some of our forages are very drought tolerant, they can be a little bit slower to recover from drought conditions. A lot of that will be dependent on our management. And as we talk about some of those management practices, we'll kind of reiterate that, specific for different species or varieties potentially. So we're going to go through different management tips. We're first going to talk about our grazing management. Ideally, we want to minimize overgrazing, and we're going to look at some visuals and the impact of what overgrazing actually does to our forage production systems. We'll talk about the U.S. Drought Monitor. I'm not going to spend a lot of time there. We do have a climatologist as part of the program today, and he can give you a lot more information and more resources than what I'm aware of or what I have on hand. Soil fertility will be important for the persistence of our forages. Of course, it's important for the production, the amount of forage we produce, but it's also going to be important for persistence as well as drought recovery. And we'll talk about those nutrients and how they influence impact of drought or drought recovery on our forages. Weed and insect control. Obviously, overall forage management, we want to reduce anything that is going to provide competition for moisture, for nutrients, sunlight, as well as anything such as insect pests that can reduce our yield, how much forage we're able to produce. Obviously, we're trying to meet the needs of livestock, either in a hay production system or in a grazing system. And then we'll talk about, we have a lot of other forage options outside of just warm season perennial forages that can fill in holes, that we can take advantage of, especially during seasons where we tend to have more moisture, that being the winter and the early spring. And there's some pros and cons to that aspect of forage management as well. So we're going to talk about all of these things. We're going to break them down, but we're going to start with minimizing overgrazing. So this is a very old photo, as you can tell by the fact that A, it's in black and white, And B, it's not necessarily, iPhone quality, but it's an excellent illustration of what happens in grazing, how our grazing management influences our root production or lack of our root system. And so our root system is very important for the persistence, the prolonged lifespan of our perennial forages. It's also going to be important, obviously, if we have a very shallow or very little or very minimal root structure, those plants are not going to be able to harvest any deeper soil moisture. And whenever we start to have dry conditions, it's the top part of our soil that dries out first, and then slowly deeper part of our soil profile starts to dry out. So if we have a very shallow root system, our we're not going, that plant is not going to be able to take advantage of any soil moisture that may be deeper in that soil profile. So those plants are not going to survive a drought. There can be a lot harder for them to recover following drought conditions. So this is an excellent picture, but it's always good to see things in real life and what it looks like, what our farm could potentially look like in a particular situation. This is an excellent example of extremely overgrazed pasture. This is in the Normandy area of central Texas. This at one time was a Bermuda grass pasture. Obviously, you can see there's more Bermuda grass in the ditch as compared to the pasture, or on this side of the fence compared to where the unfortunate animal is. But you also see a lot of weeds. That's something we have to keep in mind as we overgraze or reduce our forage growth. We're going to see encroachment of some undesired species. They may be undesired grasses that are better adapted to drought conditions, or broadleaf plants or brush species that are better adapted to those drought conditions. They have no competition, so they can take over very quickly. They can become the dominant species. They can provide very little nutritive value to your animals. And then they can also, you could potentially have some toxic species or plants that could be detrimental to your livestock if they were left to consume those on their own or only. So this is not likely to be in Texas based on the belted Galloway. It's not a very common livestock species in Texas. A little bit more common on the eastern side of the United States, but this is still a good example, or this shows us as we look at those forages, we do have some green grass out there. There is something for them to consume, but not necessarily a lot. Very little production in regards to top growth. So when we compare that to what we would potentially see under the soil surface, we're not in as bad of a condition as we were in that previous photo. However, we could do a lot better. If we, in this particular scenario, if they ended up in a drought, they didn't receive rainfall for several days, several weeks, they would very quickly be in the same situation as that previous photo, because these animals would continue to graze any growth that tried to come back with any moisture. And you can see some weed encroachment in the background. So very little forage production, a little bit better in regards to root structure. Now, if they received some rainfall, they could bounce back a little bit much quicker than that previous slide. However, if we moved into drought, we would be behind the 8 ball very quickly in that scenario. This is some better conditions where you can see there's actually quite a bit of forage still out there. You don't see nearly as many animals compared to that previous photo. So we're probably at a more moderate stocking rate in regards to the number of animals we have per acre for a given period of time. And so if we compare it to our black and white photo, we have some stubble height, some forage that we could continue to graze, and we have a pretty good root structure in existence. So we could continue to actually graze this pasture during some drought conditions at a lower stocking rate. We may need to remove animals to delay the amount of time, or delay the point of which we would be in a situation where we'd have very little forage and where we would have to start feeding animals. So if we can maintain a more moderate stocking rate, we can maintain quite a bit of forage growth that we could continue to utilize until we actually had some moisture available to us. This is ideal situation. This is obviously not during any type of drought condition. We have a good amount of forage, quite a bit of forage. We could even, we obviously see quite a few more animals because we have our amount of forage is appropriate compared to the needs of those animals. So we have an appropriate grazing pressure. We're not overgrazing this forage. So we have adequate top growth as well as we have a good strong root structure. So we could continue to definitely graze this pasture if we ended up in drought conditions. However, we wouldn't want to add additional animals. The recommendation would probably be to remove some of those animals, maybe into another pasture or into another a sacrifice location where they could be fed, or maybe even sell some of those animals to alleviate or reduce some of that grazing pressure so that forage could persist beyond the drought conditions. So this is a graph that shows us the impact of how much forage was left in the field prior to the next season. So the amount of forage that was left ungrazed can determine our next season's forage production. And a lot of people don't think about that because we only think about what we need now. And in forage production, and especially in this state and parts of our state where rainfall is erratic, who knows what normal is anymore whenever it comes to weather patterns. We could always end up with a lot of rain, no rain. It's very erratic, and it's really hard to predict. So it's always best to end the season with an appropriate stubble height that may be 3 or 4 inches or even 6 inches of forage going into the winter prior to the next season. And how much we leave in that field prior to the next summer can influence the forage production of that following summer. So we're in 2020 right now. So if we want to look at, when we look at the x-axis, we see our beginning standing crop. And this was in January, this is several years ago. So where there was very little to no forage left all the way up to almost or over 1,200 pounds of dry matter per acre that was left in the field prior to initiating grazing. If you look on the far left, that was the total annual production in pounds per acre that following season. So if say January 2020, and then on the y-axis we would have 2021. So how much forage would be produced, and then the numbers for each of those points is the amount of rainfall. So if we look at where we have very little forage left at the end of 2020, we look at our forage production in 2021, we're not up to 2,000 pounds per acre within a season. That's very little forage. And they had 16.9 inches of annual rainfall. So that's quite a bit of rainfall. You would expect to have more forage production. But because you ended 2020 with very little stubble height, very little forage left there to capture that moisture and to use that moisture, you're not going to end up with an anticipated or expected production or yield. Whereas if we go on the far right side where we have left more forage in the field in 2020, it doesn't take a lot of rainfall to produce a lot of forage, almost 4,000 pounds of dry matter per acre in 2021. So if we have more forage left in the field, it's going to be easier for that forage to recover or be productive the following season, even on less rainfall. So our management during good growing conditions hugely impacts our forage production the next season, whether we have good growing conditions again, or we end up in potentially some drought conditions or drier conditions. So I've kind of mentioned grazing pressure and stocking rate. Grazing pressure by definition is the demand to supply ratio between how much dry matter, how much forage you need to meet the needs of your livestock, and how much forage is actually available in that field. So we need to be very cognizant during good growing conditions in regards to our grazing pressure, that we're not overgrazing, that we do not have a higher demand from our animals compared to how much forage we're producing. If we increase that grazing pressure, we can end up in situations where we have very little forage. This is a good example of a more appropriate grazing pressure, where we've seen this picture before, where we have some forage. There are a few animals in that pasture, but there is more forage than there is demand. So this is a very low grazing pressure. And if if I was doing this in person, I typically ask for people to guess when or what time of year, if they thought that this picture was actually taken during a drought year or during good growing conditions. And most people, because there's green grass and everything looks pretty green, most of us would guess that this was during good growing conditions. Maybe not, high rainfall season, but at least some adequate moisture. This picture was actually taken in August of 2011. So if you look back, or if you remember the drought, the extreme drought of 2011, the drought monitor for the state of Texas, our entire state was in that extreme severe drought coloring. And this was in Normandy, Texas, so kind of central part of the state. They do not necessarily have very high average annual rainfall compared to me a little bit further east, but this was the best scenario because right across the road was this pasture. So obviously these properties were owned by two very different people. This was on the exact same day. You just stand in the middle of the road and turn 180 degrees to take both of these pictures. So obviously you don't necessarily see any animals. There were actually some animals grazing. If you remember that picture that we started with the extremely overgrazed pasture, that was the same field, just happened to be a different animal. So same weather conditions, very different management, and you can see the impact of drought. The person on the opposite side of the road obviously decreased their stocking rate, reduced their grazing pressure to allow to have more forage even during an extreme drought, compared to this landowner who probably did not change any of their grazing management, maintained a higher stocking rate with more animals per acre, that ended up overgrazing this pasture by the time you got into August, and so had very little forage production. And you can see what was the potential of forage production just on the outside of the fence, without any grazing pressure, even during the drought of 2011. So our grazing management can have a huge impact on how much forage we have during a drought, and then how quickly those forages recover from a drought. So that's very important aspect of our forage management. My philosophy, granted, I am always better safe than sorry, kind of how I operate, but I would much rather have extra forage than to run out. It's a lot easier to potentially harvest a pasture for hay because you have more forage than you have animals or demand from livestock. It's a lot easier to harvest that forage as opposed to buy forage. If we remember back trying to find hay or buy hay in the drought of 2011, it was very stressful. It was very expensive. You didn't know what you were going to get because you were getting hay from all other states. And unfortunately, people take advantage of other people when they are in an emergency situation. So make sure you are maintaining an appropriate stocking rate, an appropriate grazing pressure, even during good growing conditions. And that can definitely influence drought recovery and how much forage you could potentially maintain even during drought conditions. So following a drought, often as we try to recover from drought conditions, it is best to remain destocked, to allow that forage to recover, because those forages are going to take longer to recover, especially some of our forage species that are not as drought tolerant. Even hybrid Bermuda grass is going to take it a little bit longer to recover. It's not going to bounce back very quickly. So we need to maintain a lower stocking rate, or even in our more severely impacted pastures, I would recommend removing animals to allow for more completely full recovery before we continue to graze those pastures. So we need to think about that as we move forward through our different seasons and different weather conditions. So our next management tip is to pay attention to the U.S. Drought Monitor. Now I know John is going to talk about this in greater detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but it's a resource that I am familiar with and that I use quite often, that I find helpful for a lot of producers. Obviously, depending on where you are in the state, that influences your average annual rainfall. And then, of course, like I mentioned earlier, our how often do we actually receive our average annual rainfall? Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. Our weather patterns are very erratic. So it's great to have some tools, and I'm sure John will share some more. The one that I'm the most familiar with is the U.S. Drought Monitor. This is the homepage for that particular website. I locate it just by using a search engine such as Google and search U.S. Drought Monitor. That's the easiest way for me, at least, to find it. This is the homepage will show you the current conditions for the United States. You can click on Texas until you get down to just Texas. When you first click on Texas from the entire United States, it'll take you down to a region of Texas, Oklahoma, maybe Arkansas and Louisiana, so just a few states. But I like the fact that we can get all the way down to our state so that we can see counties. Now, this is current conditions. Most of us know what the current conditions are. We don't necessarily need a pictograph on a website to tell us that. Unless you have property in another county, this can be helpful. So you can confirm what maybe neighbors are telling you at another piece of property. But I really like the fact that we can see the current conditions for our specific county or where our property is. So you can see for a lot of you guys, unfortunately, you're still considered to be abnormally dry with some moderate drought, and there's even some severe drought speckled in there. And of course, the Panhandle is in extremely dry conditions as well. So if you can see my cursor, just to give you an idea, Overton is located in this county. So we are currently in excellent condition as far as rainfall, but we try not to take that for granted because we can dry out at any point. What I do like about this website is that they have outlooks. I prefer, or I really like the 90-day outlook. They have monthly or seasonal outlooks. This is the 90-day outlook. So this was valid on May 21st. They update this typically about the middle of the month. So the next update would be around June 20th, give or take, depending on kind of where the middle falls for June. But it shows us what they're predicting or what the outlook is for the next 90 days. So this particular map is their prediction through the end of August. Just to so you can understand the colors, the brown is drought persist. So there's a little bit of that in West Texas. Kind of the khaki color is drought remains but improves. So it looks like in Southeast Texas there is some drought remains but some improvement, hopefully with the rainfall that you've been receiving recently, and hopefully some in the future in the next couple of months as well. The green is drought removal likely. Yellow, which I don't see much yellow in the state of Texas, is drought development likely. So I like to see that outlook. This is a great tool, and John may introduce us to some other tools can help us kind of plan in advance instead of responding to a drought condition after the fact. If we can kind of plan in advance, adjust some of our strategies, whether it's fertilizing or weed control or reducing our grazing pressure, moving some animals somewhere else, selling some animals to reduce that grazing pressure before we move into some drier conditions. So these outlooks can help us determine how we need to approach our management in the next couple of months or next couple of weeks to maintain good forage production and be prepared for the potentially drought conditions as opposed to reacting to those drought conditions, which unfortunately most of us do. We tend to go along when we have rainfall and kind of happy-go-lucky and everything's great. We don't need to plan, and then we end up in a drought and we can end up behind the 8 ball, unfortunately. So our next management tip is soil fertility. Soil fertility is going to be important for, obviously, for production, the amount of forage we produce, the nutritive value of that forage, but it's also important for persistence. And persistence becomes very critical in regards to drought, surviving drought conditions, as well as recovering from drought conditions. Now, I do not recommend applying a lot of fertilizer or high rates when we are in drought conditions. It's not recommended. We need rainfall for those nutrients to be incorporated into the soil and utilized by those plants. So we do need to be mindful of our fertilizer applications actually during drought conditions. Following drought conditions, we'll have some specific recommendations, but maintaining adequate soil fertility or appropriate soil fertility for our forage species and anticipated production during good growing conditions can really help improve our drought recovery, especially for our improved forage varieties. Our hybrid Bermuda grasses are going to have a higher demand on forage nutrients. So when we talk about soil fertility, we always need to start with soil testing. It's the cheapest aspect of maintaining soil fertility. A routine soil analysis at College Station will cost you about $12, and that will give you your primary soil nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, as well as your soil pH. So depending on your species that you're growing, those requirements can vary. You know, in regards to what's needed for production and persistence of those for that particular forage species. So for Bermuda grass, specifically for coastal Bermuda grass, so a hybrid variety of Bermuda grass that is expected to be very productive. In regards to how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium is actually needed, we need 50 pounds of nitrogen, 14 pounds of phosphorus, and 42 pounds of potassium to produce 1 ton of coastal Bermuda grass. Obviously, higher volume of nutrients will lead to greater production as long as rainfall is not limited. But I wanted to spend time talking about what each of those nutrients, why they are important to forage production. Nitrogen, most of us understand. The more nitrogen we pour into a forage system, a grass system, we're going to increase our yield. We're also going to increase our crude protein content, which is a measure of quality or nutritive value of a forage, which is obviously very important if we're trying to meet the needs of various livestock species. So the more nitrogen we add, we apply, we're going to increase our yield and increase our crude protein content. So most of us understand the importance of nitrogen. Nitrogen is also important for that brilliant dark green, bright green color in our grasses. So if we start to have yellowing, we may have a deficiency in nitrogen within that forage system. In regards to as we start to recover from a drought, nitrogen will be important, but we'll need to treat those forages as they're trying to recover from drought with a lot of TLC or tender loving care, as if they're kind of, new plantings or kind of baby plants. They don't need large volumes of nitrogen. Nitrogen is a very mobile nutrient, so applying large volumes, we can lose a lot of that nitrogen, and then it can no longer be economical to make those applications when our forages are trying to recover from drought and do not need or are not going to consume a lot of nitrogen at one time. So we'll need to keep those nitrogen applications smaller, maybe multiple applications through the season, depending on rainfall, or if you continue to receive some rainfall as you recover. Phosphorus, in regards to drought recovery, phosphorus is going to be one of the more important nutrients because phosphorus is important for root growth and development. And we saw those pictures before about what happens to our roots with different grazing pressure. So rebuilding that root structure following a drought is going to be very important. That's going to be one of the most important aspects of drought recovery with our forages, is having the nutrients, having phosphorus to rebuild that root structure below the soil surface. So we'll talk about in a minute in regards to how we need to approach our soil testing to focus on our phosphorus needs. Our third primary nutrient is potassium. In my experience in almost 12 years here in Texas, the potassium deficiency is a primary reason I have seen loss of stands of a lot of our Bermuda grass stands in central and in East Texas. Bermuda grass requires quite a bit of potassium. If you remember back, we need 42 pounds of potassium to produce a ton of Bermuda grass, and we needed 50 pounds of nitrogen. So we need almost as much potassium as we do nitrogen. So unfortunately, a lot of people tend not to apply potassium because we may not understand why it's even important. We understand nitrogen. We see an impact. We put nitrogen out, it rains, our grass grows. You don't see the same visual impact with potassium, but you can see a visual impact if you have a deficiency in potassium. That Bermuda grass will start to thin, be less productive. You'll have more competition from weed species that are undesirable. And potassium, as you can see here, it's important for water use efficiency. So it is important for drought recovery. So it's always important to make sure that potassium is appropriate for your forage species. If you have Bermuda grass, it's going to be very important. Unfortunately, Bermuda grass can be a luxury consumer of potassium. So you will see on a soil analysis, they will recommend splitting potassium applications in smaller allotments so that that Bermuda grass doesn't use large quantities of potassium. And then at the beginning of the season, potentially, and then you could have a deficiency by the end of the season. So we want to make sure we have appropriate phosphorus and potassium for those forages as we're moving potentially into drought, and then of course as we're recovering from drought. Now, your soil type will have an influence on how infertile your soils are. Your soil texture has a huge impact on that. Where I'm located in East Texas, we have very sandy soils that are very infertile, so they do not hold nutrients very well, and they definitely do not hold a lot of potassium. So that's why I frequently see a lot of potassium deficiency issues in our Bermuda grass pastures in East Texas. So your soil type will impact what nutrients or how well those soils hold on to those nutrients. But without a soil analysis, you're not going to know what would be needed or what's needed to maintain appropriate forage cover as well as persistence of those forages. So this is an excellent illustration of how balanced nutrition is important. A lot of times if our fertilizer prices are high, we obviously make economical choices, and a lot of times we tend to only apply nitrogen because we know what it does. We understand, we actually can see a visual impact of that nitrogen application. But for all of our forages, not only is nitrogen important, but so is phosphorus and potassium, and those can be really important in regards to drought persistence and drought recovery. So following a drought, as we're trying to revive or recover our forages, my recommendation would be to send a soil analysis, especially if you haven't done one in a considerable time. And you may or may not be able to notice on this soil sample form that I've actually selected minimum requirement. So that is what I would that's what I would recommend as you are soil sampling following a drought, because like I said, these plants are going to be very sensitive. They're not going to need heavy volumes of nutrients as they start to recover and try to build top growth and build additional root structure. So selecting minimum requirement is the best recommendation, so that the soils lab knows that you don't want the highest demand or the highest recommendation. You could also select a new planting or new establishment. That could also indicate that these plants are very sensitive and that they've been stressed, that they are stressed. The other aspect of this, the soils lab will also focus on phosphorus. We talked about phosphorus being important for root growth and development. When you have a new planting or a forage that is recovering from drought, we need to focus on that phosphorus level. Now, we don't need a lot of phosphorus per se. We just need to make sure that we have an appropriate amount of phosphorus to meet that demand on that plant as it tries to recover from drought conditions. They'll also focus on potassium. Of course, for drought tolerance, it's also going to be important for that recovery from drought conditions. So our next tip is weed and insect control. Obviously, during drought conditions, we're not likely, I do not recommend actually spraying herbicides for weed control. That's not the recommendation during drought conditions. Realize during drought conditions, you may see more weeds. If our forages are stressed, our weeds are also going to be stressed, and they're not going to actively take in that herbicide. So it'll be a very costly venture for you and not very effective. We need good growing conditions for our forages as well as for those weeds, those undesired vegetation. So if we manage our weeds prior to drought conditions, when we have good growing conditions, that can help reduce some of that weed pressure when we end up in a drought scenario. Obviously, weeds will compete for moisture and nutrients compared against our desired forages. So it's always ideal to try to manage those populations and to manage them appropriately. Different management strategies for weed control Obviously, if we follow best management practices, many of which we've been talking about in regards to not overgrazing our pastures to the point where we have very little competition. Many of our weed species are not very competitive. So if we have excellent ground cover, we have good strong root systems within our desired forages, we're not as likely to see some of those particular weed issues. If we're maintaining soil fertility and an appropriate soil pH for that forage species, they can continue to grow and be productive and provide some competition against some of those undesired species. Mowing is quite frequently utilized for weed control. There are pros and cons. Sometimes during drought conditions, it may be the best option to try to reduce some of that pressure from your forage systems. It's not necessarily, or it's not always recommended as a long-term method of weed control, but there are some scenarios when it is our best method or our only method, depending on the time of year, the weed species that we're trying to control as well. Of course, herbicides, the use of herbicides, we're frequently using to control weed populations. So weed control prior to a drought and following a drought can be very important. During a drought, do not recommend the use of herbicides. A lot of our products will have recommendations on weather conditions in regards to when they are most effective and it's appropriate to use those products. Insect pests can also be detrimental to our forage production. The picture of the grasshoppers that was actually taken during the drought of 2011. You may or may not see our little buddy down here in the lower left-hand corner. This was actually in a herbicide trial that I had put together or was managing for DuPont at that time. And when they asked whether their product worked on the weeds, I told them there were potentially 3 things that killed those weeds in those plots: the drought, the grasshoppers, or their herbicide. Obviously, the drought and the grasshoppers did quite a bit of damage, so it was kind of a wash in regards to any type of research project. So grasshoppers can be very detrimental to forage production. They're not very selective. They're not picky consumers, as you can tell. During drought conditions, they were eating whatever they could find. They even ate my plastic plot flags, you know, the flags that they put in your yard to mark electrical lines before you cut down a tree. Those same flags, they actually ate my flags. So they were not very picky, and especially during drought conditions. They consume half of their body weight every day. So controlling things such as grasshoppers can help maintain appropriate forage production. We have a lot of insecticide choices. They're not necessarily very expensive, and they can save us a lot of forage by maintaining or controlling a lot of these insect species. The others that are pictured here, the larva in the upper right-hand corner, we're probably all very familiar with, the fall armyworm. As if we have been in a drought or have had dry conditions and we receive some rainfall, I would highly recommend that you scout for armyworms. They prefer cooler, more moisture adequate environmental conditions compared to whereas grasshoppers typically thrive in hot, dry conditions. So if we have been dry and we receive some rainfall, I would recommend scouting your fields for fall armyworms. And you guys, unfortunately, will get them a lot faster than we tend to get them in Northeast Texas. The moths overwinter in South Texas and down in Mexico. And then as we move into spring and summer, they move with air currents up into the more central and northern parts of our state. They can do damage overnight and they can consume a lot of forage, especially the larger larvae. They consume about 85% of their body weight, or 85% of their diet is consumed at the later larva stages. So when they're much larger, and they get up to about 1.5 inches long. They typically are more indiscriminate eaters, more picky eaters. They prefer higher quality forages, so they can be very detrimental on winter forages, annual ryegrass or small grains that have been planted in the fall. They're also going to prefer your well-fertilized Bermuda grass over your neighbor's unfertilized Bermuda grass or your neighbor's Bahia grass potentially. So scouting will be important, and a lot of our insecticides that control grasshoppers will also control armyworms. Last but not least is a fairly new insect pest, and that would be the Bermuda grass stem maggot. And so that is the actual maggot within a stem of Bermuda grass. It is only a pest in Bermuda grass species. So whether it is common Bermuda grass, Tifton 85, or coastal Bermuda grass, you more than likely will have or have had the Bermuda grass stem maggot in the state of Texas. Our first reports were back in 2012, and they've continued to be a problem throughout the entire state wherever there is Bermuda grass. We most frequently see damage in a hay situation or a hay meadow because we're harvesting that forage every 3 to 4 to 5 weeks. So we are not removing that top growth as compared to a pasture where we're grazing that forage. Those animals, whether it's horses or cows, are removing that top portion. So the adult fly lays their eggs on the Bermuda grass plant. When that egg hatches, the maggot moves into the stem of that plant to the very top node. It eats the plant material within that stem, and that leads to the death or the loss of the top 2 to 3 leaves of that Bermuda grass plant. So it will have a huge impact on your yield. So in some research that Dr. Alan Knudsen and Forrest Mitchell did, for every 1% of Bermuda grass stem maggot damage, you will lose about 8.9 pounds, almost 9 pounds of Bermuda grass dry matter per acre. So if you extrapolate that to a higher percentage of damage, you can lose quite a bit of forage or quite a bit of yield. So some control recommendations. Unfortunately, all that we can do is control the adult flies because the maggots are protected within that stem. And so our recommendation is the use of a pyrethroid insecticide, many of which that are labeled for grasshoppers and armyworms. Making an application. If you see damage in a hay meadow, we'd recommend that you harvest very quickly. The maggot will pupate into the soil. It will not be transferred, does not feed on dry hay. And then within 7 days after that harvest, come back and spray a pyrethroid insecticide, and you will probably have flies that have reemerged that you will control. And if you have had substantial damage, you may want to consider in another 7 to 10 days a second application of a pyrethroid insecticide. We're continuing to do research to improve our recommendations and maybe find some better solutions instead of always using a pyrethroid insecticide. So we're looking at some different alternatives, but right now that is our best recommendation. So far, we have not seen weather conditions that influence those populations. For me, in East Texas, I typically get questions or reports on Bermuda grass stem maggot damage towards the end of June, beginning of July. For you guys, it could be a little bit earlier. They are a tropical pest, so heat does not deter them. We're not aware as of yet how drought or any other weather conditions affect those populations. So if you have Bermuda grass, I would recommend scouting your fields to look for these insect pests or the potential damage that they have caused. They can have a huge impact on your forage production. Now, it does seem weird as we're talking about drought and drought recovery to talk about planting something, and especially a cool season annual forages. But cool season annual forages could potentially provide an opportunity for us following drought, as these forages are typically planted late September, early October. For you guys, probably planted a little bit later. Think about when your average frost date is, and then probably 6 weeks prior to that would be a good time to plant these forages. If we have been in a drought situation, I would not necessarily recommend overseeding into pastures or even hay meadows that have been impacted by drought that previous summer. So if you have some new property, or if you anticipate based on drought conditions and how your forages did not, if you didn't have an excellent stand going into a drought and drought really reduce your forage production, you may think about reestablishing in the future. And instead of letting that land lay fallow all winter, you could plant a cool season forage, hope to capitalize maybe on some winter or spring rainfall, and you could provide some grazing during that winter spring season as opposed to feeding hay. So this is some overseeded ryegrass and small grain rye in Overton, so in East Texas, where we do tend to have higher average annual rainfall. And this has been overseeded into a Tifton 85 Bermuda grass stand. But I do not recommend overseeding drought stressed forages that season. So these are some forages that we can utilize during good growing conditions, or if we are in a scenario where we are going to need to reestablish that field following that drought, and we have good anticipation of having some moisture during the winter. That can reduce our hay feeding or supplemental feeding, and we can put some weight back on those animals following drought conditions. So we have a lot of different options depending on your location in the state. Sometimes our recommendations can vary, and the forage production of these species is once again highly dependent on rainfall. There is a cost, of course, associated with establishment of these forages, seed costs, land preparation, as well as fertilizer. Fertilizer is going to be important for these forages as well, but they can be a tool that we can incorporate into our systems to provide winter grazing, to fill a void during the year where we're typically feeding hay or feeding supplement. And then we can save that hay or that supplemental feed for drought times or drought conditions. So it's another tool in our arsenal that we can use in our forage systems. The reason why I do not recommend overseeding a drought stressed perennial stand of an improved forage is because even in good growing conditions, our sod management during the fall for planting of cool season forages such as ryegrass or a clover or small grain, as well as the actual growth on those cool season forages, can impact our Bermuda grass forage production that next season. So we do not want to add additional stress on top of a forage system that is already stressed. So that is why we do not recommend overseeding if you have a pasture that's trying to recover from drought. Now, like I said, if you plan to reestablish instead of letting that land lay fallow, this can be an excellent tool. So I realize this is a lot of information in one table. I think Dr. Evers tried to fill it up as much as possible, but I'll try to direct you on how to view this. So we have our stubble height across the very top of this chart, this table. The stubble height was moving into the planting season. So in the fall, we had 1 inch of stubble height versus 4 inches of stubble height. And then we also had different forage species that were overseeded into a coastal Bermuda grass stand. So we had arrowleaf clover, annual ryegrass, crimson clover, or it was not overseeded at all. Now on the left-hand side, in the far left column, we have a control where there was no seedbed preparation. So the seed was simply broadcast into an existing stand. We did not disc or do anything to that Bermuda grass stand, to that soil, to disrupt that Bermuda grass. The second option there is disked. That forage, that Bermuda grass sod, since it creates a very dense sod, was lightly disked to increase seed to soil contact for that arrowleaf or ryegrass or that cool season forage that was applied, that was planted. So when you look at these different treatments, if you just look at for the coastal Bermuda grass, you can just look at the not overseeded, just look at the impact of forage production on Bermuda grass the following year. So if this was planted in 2020, we're looking at the forage production on Bermuda grass in 2021. So just by having a shorter stubble height in the fall has a huge impact on our forage production that following season. And we already talked about that when we looked at that graph in regards to how much forage we left in that field the previous season and how that impacts our forage production the next year. So stubble height can have a huge impact on our forage production for Bermuda grass that next season. Overseeding will also decrease forage production. These cool season forages, especially our legumes and annual ryegrass, are very productive in the spring. If we do not manage them appropriately by grazing them down or by harvesting those forages in the spring, they can delay breaking of dormancy for our warm season perennial forages because they are competing for sunlight, they're competing for moisture and nutrients. And for our warm season perennial forages, we do want to try to capitalize on some of that spring rainfall. So a lot of things we need to think about before we actually use or utilize cool season forages. There's a lot of pros, but there are also a lot of cons, as there is with everything. But once again, following a drought, I do not recommend overseeding any cool season forages into a drought stressed Bermuda grass or warm season perennial sod, unless you do intend to completely reestablish. Maybe you decide to switch forage species based on drought tolerance, or you know that stand is just not going to recover that next season. So a lot of things to keep in mind, but cool season forages can be an excellent forage option if they fit within your forage system. So as we kind of close and summarize, well-managed forages will recover much more rapidly and more completely. So our following best management practices during good growing conditions can really influence how those forages persist or recover from drought conditions. And those best management practices include maintaining soil fertility, maintaining an appropriate stocking rate so that we're not overgrazing those forages to the point where we have depleted those root structures, where those plants cannot recover from drought conditions, cannot access deeper soil moisture, and maintaining an appropriate stubble height as we move into the winter, closer to 3 or 4 inches. And if it looks like we're going to end up being dry, it's better to maintain a higher stubble height as we move into potentially dry conditions. Maintaining 6 inches of stubble height for our improved forages is going to be much more appropriate, and those forages will recover more quickly from drought conditions if we have more forage in the field. So it's a lot. There's a lot that goes into forage management for recovering from drought, dealing with drought conditions. But like I said, if we promote or follow best management practices during good conditions, we can actually have forage production even during and following drought conditions. So with that, I do have, if you're interested in locating me or additional forage information, I do have a website. It is foragefacts.tamu.edu. You can actually subscribe to this website. Anytime I post kind of an article or new information, you would receive that in an email. That typically goes out every Friday about 5 o'clock in the evening. So a good Friday evening, good Friday read to kick off your evening. Sometimes I do a focus on a weed or a particular issue. So if we looked like, as you can see in 2013, there was a topic of discussion on drought conditions in the state of Texas. So we also try to hit issues or current issues for Central and East Texas. I often have visiting other specialists or researchers. I've had Dr. Clayton has written an article for me before for Forage Facts, so you may see information from other specialists across the state. So, but I'll be happy to answer questions